Well, this is Church History 2 at Gateway Seminary, and we are studying the Great Awakenings. You'll notice that I put an S on the end of that, the Great Awakenings. And there's a couple different ways that we can look at that. On one hand, we talk about the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, in the sense that those are two separate, larger revival movements that were across the American colonies, and really a transatlantic movement that also reached to England and to the United Kingdom. And so we can think about that. There's two great awakenings in that sense, right? One in the really sort of early and mid 18th century, and then one that is primarily at the very end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. And those are two awakenings. But another way that that actually is a helpful term to use with that plural, that S at the end, is also the fact that these larger movements, even if we look at the First Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, really it's that there is a sense in which we can speak of that as a unified, larger phenomenon. But what you have is lots of smaller revivals breaking out, again, across the American colonies and within England. And certainly in other parts of the world, these things are felt as well. For instance, with the Second Great Awakening, as it ultimately is going to be a part of leading to missionary movements across the world. And so, although we often, and will surely continue to speak of a First Great Awakening and a Second Great Awakening, the fact is that these really represent lots of smaller, somewhat even decentralized movements that are trans-denominational and that are led by many different people. Some that are large sort of celebrity type names like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and others in the First Great Awakening. And then in the Second Great Awakening, men like Charles Finney and so on. But also many pastors and preachers that their names have been lost to history or are known only by experts that would be studying this in the field of history. But I want to talk about the Great Awakenings not merely by tracing the history of them, as much as that's a worthy enterprise. You're going to get a lot of that in the reading. You're going to get a lot of that in broader surveys of this subject. But I want to talk about a few key impacts of the Great Awakening. Some are explicitly and primarily theological and religious, but some are also social. And in that day and age especially, there tends to be some overlap, and that tends to be true anywhere there's a mighty move of God. And so as we talk about the Great Awakening, thinking about the first one certainly, but also thinking about the Second Great Awakening, let me give you some timelines for this. For the First Great Awakening, we're primarily speaking about movements that are beginning in the 1730s. So there is no United States left. These are American colonies, but they are under the authority and jurisdiction of Great Britain. And so in the colonial period in North America, in the 1730s, there begin to be significant, notable, and even remarkable movements of God, where large numbers of people are professing faith in Christ or are being renewed in their faith and are being sent out as missionaries and disciple makers and so on. Churches are expanding and so on. So that is a movement beginning in the 1730s, but then there are waves of it that continue into the 1740s, into the 1750s, and really only come to slow down in the 1760s, and really into the 1770s as we think about the beginning of the American Revolution, when so much now at that point becomes civil. There's an attention to civil issues and even military conflict, and so that seems to be a nice way to kind of put bookends on this movement. So the First Great Awakening, 1730s into the 1770s. And then there is a little bit of a lull. It's not completely gone. There's still things that we could point at and say, wow, there's something remarkable that happened in Connecticut or in Virginia in the 1780s. But really, it's at the very, very end of the 18th century, so the 1700s. But really, we're talking right about the year 1800 or so. In Kentucky, there's a significant outpouring at Cane Ridge. And so this, as we get to the Second Great Awakening, the very end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and basically through the 1830s, so we're talking about 3.5 decades or so, this is more of a frontier phenomenon. So if the First Great Awakening is really along this narrow strip of the American colonies, as well as, again, a transatlantic phenomenon that is going on in Great Britain as well, the Second Great Awakening, we're talking about a generation, two, maybe even three generations removed, from certainly the earliest part of the First Great Awakening. That is going on primarily into the West, into the American frontier, in places, as I mentioned, like Kentucky, but also Ohio and Tennessee, as well as the western parts of the American colonies. So North Carolina is one of the original 13 colonies, and yet the western part of the state is very much remote and very rural and disconnected from the coastal areas that had been developed during the colonial period. And so this is a movement that is stretching westward and really has just significant implications for the growth of the church and so on, as well as American society. And so that's what I want to talk about now. Now that we kind of understand there is a Great Awakening, plural, both within the first and second era, but then also several smaller different movements. There might be something going on in Kentucky, but also going on in what is now West Virginia and in Western Connecticut and so on and so forth. So here are 6 impacts of these great awakenings in American society. Well, one of them, and the most important perhaps as we think about just sort of the baseline here, is the phenomenal church growth. We can go statistically and look at the number of Baptist churches, which become a real sort of winner in this as we think about some denominations sort of plateauing and declining as we get into the Revolutionary era and into the 19th century. Episcopalians, what we would call Episcopalians today, it was the Church of England at the time, they're going to go into decline, but upstart groups, and this is a term that historians use, speak about this just as a phenomenological thing. They can see that there's an upstart, right? Groups like the Baptists and the Methodists surge during this, again, First Great Awakening and into the Second Great Awakening, where you get into the 19th century, and now Methodists and Baptists are by far the largest denominations, and they're sort of both vying for it. Methodists are initially larger, and then Baptists are catching up and eventually surpass them as we get closer into the mid part of the 1800s. Whereas groups like Presbyterians, they're also growing, but not nearly at the same sort of rate. And there's all kinds of reasons for this. A reason that the Church of England, the Anglicans or Episcopalians, begin to decline is partially social. No longer are these denominations going to be supported by the state. No longer are the colonies a part of the Great Britain, of the English Empire. And so those sort of churches in some ways begin to fall out of favor, except with the highest classes of society. And so as those churches recede, Congregationalism certainly has some growth, which are basically the children of the Puritans, the descendants of the Puritans. Those churches continue to have some growth, but nothing like the Baptists, nothing like the Methodists. So the first significant growth I want you to see, or first significant development or impact of the Great Awakenings, is a massive surge in church growth. We can look at simple baptism records, which Baptists often use as a way to just determine how many people are being added to the church. And we can look at the number of churches planted and organizations, now churches partnering together. It really is a remarkable surge, sort of compounding growth as we look at these great awakenings. The impact was massive. The second one is the development of schools. Now, all of the earliest schools that were founded in North America were religious in nature. They were going to be Protestant in nature. So Harvard, what eventually becomes Harvard University, was initially Harvard College, of course, was founded by Christians to train Christian ministers as well as others for a society that was at that time understood to be Christian in some way. Of course, after that, you eventually have Yale and so on. These are universities that are founded by Christians with Christian principles governing them, even if we have some theological things that are eventually going to develop and they're going to move in a different direction than they had from their orthodox moorings. They are still ultimately have this Christian background. But in this era of the First Great Awakening and into the Second Great Awakening, many other schools are being founded that are, again, not only religious in character, but even have a greater fervency to them, at least initially. Schools like Dartmouth and Princeton and Brown. Of course, Brown University being the only Ivy League school that was founded by Baptists. Princeton founded by Presbyterians. And we could look at many more. That's just to name a few. And so as the church grows, and as it advances moving into the Western United States, again, particularly during the Second Great Awakening, from about 1800 to 1830s, we have there's an interest in building the kingdom of God, including through training people for all of the different trades that they would go into, as well as again training ministers of the gospel, those who would be professionally involved in ministry. So that's the second one, is schools. Number 3 is you have denominational splits. And so it's not all positive in the sense that not all are harmonizing and working together. It is trans-denominational. There is a great sense of partnership and shared activity in these revivals and in the different work that they're doing together. And yet not everyone rallies to the awakenings. Some see them as disruptive. Some see them even as demonic and would say that they would reject them. And so you have some denominations, Presbyterians for instance, that actually have a sort of split, where one group is pro-revival and one is not. Congregationalists have the same. And then among Baptists, really, you don't have a denominational split, but what you do have is you have some that are going to be fervently involved in the revivals, so much so that you have people who were Congregationalists that are flowing out and ultimately becoming Baptists as they become very pro-revival in this, what at the time, Baptist being a very fervent and revivalistic tradition that is extending from that. Ultimately, this whole stream in Baptist life called the Separate Baptists. And if we had more time, I would go into that. So, but you have some denominational splits, as well as new denominations. So the Disciples of Christ in the Christian churches, what are sometimes called the Restorationist movement, those are flowing out of the Second Great Awakening. So you have new denominations being formed in this time as well. Number 4 is a renewed interest in missions. So already from the very beginning, there was a desire to evangelize the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans. There was a desire to reach out into other parts of the world eventually that are going to develop. But I would know that there is an important missions sort of surge, a renewed interest to minister to Native Americans, a renewed interest to reach English-speaking and other immigrant settlers that are coming through. You have Germans, you have Irish, and so on, that are also coming. And so there was a renewed interest to do missions among those domestically, and eventually to send people to do missions in a cross-cultural, international. That sounds a bit anachronistic, but sending people to the nations that eventually is going to develop. And some of that fervency is flowing out of the First and Second Great Awakenings. So there's massive church growth, there's a development of schools, there is some denominational reshuffling and even some splits, and then there is renewed mission interest. Number 5 is you actually have, this is primarily a social phenomenon, you have a unification of the denominations. And so of the colonies, rather, let me rephrase that, you have a unification of the American colonies. The fact is, in 1720, the American colonies had been around for a while. Most of them had been founded by that point. Of course, you have Georgia that are a little bit later, and so on. But these are independent colonies. You have Virginia, you have Connecticut, you have Massachusetts, you have these different colonies, North and South Carolina. These are independent colonies owned by Great Britain, under the authority and power of Great Britain, yes. So there was a sense in which there was that. They were all English in their foundings in that way, but very different. Rhode Island was very different from Virginia. Rhode Island is very different from the other states in New England, other colonies in New England. And so, but through these revival movements, through some of the development even of, again, figures like George Whitefield, who I mentioned earlier, he becomes sort of the first American celebrity. His name was known, his face was seen, he preached to more people than anyone up to that point in the American colonies. There really begins to grow a sense of cohesion among these scattered colonies, to where they begin to see themselves amongst some, there's some other things going on culturally and socially that are contributing to this, but one of them is this religious movement in the First Great Awakening, and ultimately the Second Great Awakening is coming after the Revolution, but it is also giving a sense of cohesion now within the infant nation of the United States. And so it's just a fascinating thing, the way that religion in this way has this ability to help unite a people in these disparate colonies. Lastly, number 6 is this idea of what we would call disinterested benevolence. That's the way it was termed at the time, disinterested benevolence. Christians have always had a sense of charity and a desire to to feed the hungry, to clothe the poor, to care for the widow. Those things are biblical. Those things have always been part of the Christian tradition. So that's to be assumed. Even if Christians have not always fulfilled that, it has always been a part of the Christian tradition. There would be a desire to care for orphans and so on and so forth. And yet there is a growth, a greater attention, a greater desire as the kingdom of God is ultimately becomes this all-consuming desire during these revivals, especially during the First Great Awakening, but certainly in the second as well. You have all kinds of charitable organizations that are founded. You have orphanages that are founded. You have, again, I've mentioned schools. You have hospitals that are going to be developed. Christians have done these things since the Middle Ages, since the ancient world. And yet within these movements, there is a greater desire to do these, as well as things developing such as the abolitionist movement. It's flowing out of these religious movements, this understanding of the unity of humanity, that all human beings are created in God's image and thus worthy of dignity, and the very simple things involved with that, like the liberty of being human, not being owned by another, as was the practice in chattel slavery. And so there's this abolitionist movement that is coming out of this, that is growing. Now, of course, it takes a while. It ultimately takes a civil war for this thing to be reckoned with at a national level. And yet Christians begin to be involved in this, both in the UK. We think of William Wilberforce, and we think of the activity there, something very much that I think many of us are aware of. But in the American colonies, certainly this becomes a major impulse, and the abolitionist movement is developing throughout into the 19th century, flowing out of the latter part of the 18th century. And so these are 6 impacts. We could look at others of the Great Awakenings. And so how important were these movements? My goodness. It shaped, not just changed, not just shifted, but truly in many ways shaped the character of American religion and thus American society. If you are interested in this topic, I would highly recommend Thomas Kidd's book, The Great Awakening. It was written in 2007, published in 2007. It is still the standard. So many other books that address the First Great Awakening, but this would be the first one that I would send you to. And I would note that Thomas Kidd is working on right now to publish, I believe, in 2024. So we're still a little bit out, a couple years out. He'll publish one on the Second Great Awakening. And so definitely you might keep your eye out for that. If you perhaps find yourself more interested in this, if you are a pastor, if you are a missionary, if you're a church planter, whatever sort of ministry you're going into, understanding how these things have shaped American society as well as European society, Great Britain. And I think there's much that we can learn from it, as well as just appreciating what God has done among us.